And I'm going to call this episode 2, because if Esther was a TV miniseries, which it could easily be, because each chapter has a cliffhanger, and it is and we'll get into some of this stuff. Last week would basically be the season premiere, and you get an introduction to all these characters. Like, you've learned King Xerxes and Queen Vashti, and you know about Mordecai and his cousin Esther, and some events happen to start. But episode 2, right now that you know the characters, the villain arrives, and he's twirling his little mustache, and he's wearing the black hat, and he's going to come in. But one of the things I want to do, here's my goal for tonight, is I relate everything to fitness. Not another fitness analogy, yes, but everything we do over there on that side is to accommodate different people from different walks of life, just like this. And everything we do is what's called exercise progression. There is a level 1, level 2, level 3 application. Level 1 is an entry-level beginner, just to get started with something. Level 2 is kind of this intermediate level, and level 3 is advanced. So to carry on this fitness analogy, I have everyone from 20-somethings to 80-somethings. That's a vast difference of age groups. My 83-year-old guy can't do what the 26-year-old guy can do, nor should he. However, he still has to be able to do things in life to function and move and to keep the as my dad likes to say, as a rolling stone gathers no moss, right? So he's got to be able to move, and he has to do the same exercises. So for example, if we're doing the squat, the advanced person may do heavy weighted squats. The intermediate person may do body weight squats. He sits in a chair and stands back up, and sits in a chair and stands back up, and that's his squat, but they're all squatting. Everybody's doing it, different applications. There's a level 1, level 2, level 3 application to Esther. On one side of it, it's just the beginner entry level. It's a book. It's a story. This is the suspense novel of the Bible. Because you could take this, if you didn't have a faith in God and you didn't believe in God and all this Christianity stuff, you could take the Book of Esther out of the Bible, repackage it, put it up in Barnes & Noble, and it's a dramatic, suspense-filled palace drama, intrigue, plot, twists and turns. It's a great book. It's a phenomenal book by itself. But that's just level 1. We're going to read the story. But what I want to show you is the story behind the story, because there is one. And I'm going to talk to you about this guy right here. Who is this? Who is the villain that's going to appear? His name's Haman, right? Cursed Haman, right? Why is he the villain? And on one side, he's a bad dude, and he's going to do bad things. Okay, we get that. But there's a story behind it. And I made this graphic last week because we often talk about Ephesians 6:12, that our battle is not against people. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, right? It's this. There is a puppet master. What we see out there in life is the puppets, and we get caught up into the puppets. And the only difference is we can't actually see the hands pulling the strings. The interesting thing is the puppets think they're in control. The puppets think they're brilliant. They think they're powerful, right? So for example, the Putins and the Zelenskys and the Bidens and the Macrons and the Johnsons, all these guys are powerful people who would say they're very smart, they're masterminds, they're geniuses. They're puppets. They're being manipulated, and they don't even know it. And if I was sitting down with Biden or Macron or any of those guys, probably wouldn't want to sit down with Putin. But if I was, I would say, hey, listen, sir, you are being manipulated. You're not in control of what you're. So the point is, we battle not against flesh and blood. The puppet. And this guy Haman is going to rise in the ranks of political power. He's a puppet. Who is the puppet master? And that's what I want to touch on with this right here. So let's kind of, if this was a episode 2, you'd always have like a recap of last week's episode, right? Here's an introduction: a king, a queen, a pawn, and the providence of God. We know who the king is. We know who the queen is. There's an invisible hand of God, and you'll discover today who the pawn in the story is. But here it is. It's a strange book. And the more you study Esther, the stranger it becomes. And you haven't seen strange yet, but we will reveal that. It's an interesting story, fascinating period of history, right? The Arabian Nights tale, palace conspiracies, love, romance, and the glory days of the Persian Empire. And it's a rags to riches story. You got a Jewish captive, a servant girl that rises to become the first lady of a world empire. Wow. And prevents a Hitler-like annihilation of the Jews. That's captivating. But the mystery part of it is No mention of the name God. It will hint at something, but will never mention God's name. No prediction of Jesus coming. Jesus is in every book of the Bible. That's the thing, right? He's all throughout the Old Testament. The Old Testament was pointing to his coming, right? He shows up all through the Old Testament. He's hanging out with Adam and Eve in the garden. He shows up for lunch at Abraham's house. He shows up to fight with Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. Hangs out with Daniel's 3 buddies in the fiery furnace. He pops up all along throughout the Old Testament. No mention of him anywhere. No word about worship or faith. In tonight's episode, they're going to talk about prayer and faith and not even mention the words. And yet it's almost like it's purposely taken out and hidden. Not one word is said about heaven or hell. Nothing Christian, religious about the entire book. It's an incredible story, but why is it in the Bible, right? That's the big question. Why is it in there? And we mentioned, you can go through commentators, Martin Luther, John Calvin, great men of the faith. They say it shouldn't be in the Bible. And yet you're going to see that however you want to pronounce his name, Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, Yaheh-Vah-Heh, where we get the name Jehovah, God's unpronounceable name, it's encrypted underneath the text in so many ways that will blow your mind when we get there. We're going to go through the story, and then we're going to see the story behind it. But let's take a look at this right here. This plot thickens. I'm going to call this the wrath of the Amalekites, because one thing we need to get is, who are these guys? Who is Haman, and what's he got to do with the Amalekites? So let's kind of reverse engineer this. We know that Haman is a really bad guy in the Book of Esther, and he's going to try to kill Esther and Mordecai and all the other Jews. That would make him the villain. If you're going to try to exterminate a race of people, that makes you a bad guy. But where did he come from? Well, he is what's called an Agag. He came from King Agag. And back in 1 Samuel 15, this is part of your reading homework. So hopefully you did this, but the Israelites had judges and God was their king. But that wasn't enough. They wanted their own king. Everybody else has kings. Well, God's your king. Yeah, but we want a human king. Okay, great. So they pick out the tallest guy, the most handsome guy, 6'6", 245. Think about a slightly taller Jeff Milligan. Okay, just right there, just rock solid. You know, six-pack abs. And they pick him out, and they say, we're going to make him our king, right? And it's Saul. And you know the story of Saul. He's a flawed character. He looks amazing. He's the best-looking guy in town, but he's a flawed individual. And so one of his first things with his first actions, God said, hey, Saul, I want you to go wipe out the Amalekites. And this is hard for people to understand because God's command was, Saul, I want you to go wipe out every man, every woman, every child, every animal they have. I want you to delete it from the face of this earth. And it's, wow. Had this conversation with this guy today who was talking about how he's not a believer. He referenced the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, because obviously there's 2 different gods. There's the mean God who will bring down hellfire, and then there's a loving God that just walks through the, it's Jesus. It just walks through, I'm just a peaceful, loving person, that would never hurt a fly. But God commands this. And the question is, that's hard to, why would a loving God want to exterminate that? Well, the thing is, Saul didn't do it. He did 99.9% of it, but he spared some of the really good cattle and the really good treasures, and he spared the king and queen of the Amalekites. Okay, spared them. And then Samuel comes up to me and says, Saul, my man, what have you done? Well, I did everything you said. Well, no, you did. You didn't do everything. You kept some of the really good cows. Oh, well, I'm going to do that for sacrifice. And Samuel tells him something really smart, because God's command was wipe all the animals out, and he saved the best. Yeah, but Samuel, you don't understand. I'm going to use those to sacrifice to God. That's why I saved it. And he has a great quote that we could all learn from. And you may know this. It is better to have obedience than sacrifice. It's better to obey God than to sacrifice. In our world, it is better to obey God's commands than to tithe. It is better to obey God's commands than to check the box that I went to church. It's better to worship God than so many other things that we do. So it's that obedience over sacrifice. Saul messed up. So he didn't wipe out the Amalekites, but that doesn't answer the question, why would God tell him to exterminate it? Let's go back a little further. The Battle of Rephidim, way back in Exodus, you know, the Hebrews were coming out of Egypt and they're traveling through the wilderness wanderings, right? And here were these Amalekites, and they were basically picking them off. And so here you got 1 to 2 million people going through the wilderness. Not everybody is in tip-top shape, right? You've got the injured, the infirmed, and the elderly. And so the ones that were coming behind, they would pick them off. And they would take the weak, and they would take the sick, and they would take the elderly, and they would kill them. They'd slaughter them. And finally, Moses says, okay, enough of this. We've lost too many people to these darn Amalekites. Caleb, you and Joshua, I want you to get the men together. We're going to go out and fight them tomorrow. And so they're preparing for battle. And here comes the Amalekite army, and they're marching, and they've got their banners and their insignia, the Amalekite army, and they're marching in order, like a drill team. And they've got their armory, and they've got their weaponry. And here comes the Israelites out with sticks and shovels, a ragtag group. And you remember the story, Moses holds up the staff, and when he holds up the staff, Israelites are winning. When his arms drop, the Amalekites win. And so they had to put the stones there to keep his arms up. Well, but God had declared war on them. And this is one thing it said in Deuteronomy. He says, I want you to remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. Matter of fact, they hated God. These were enemies of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he has given you to possess as inheritance, i.e., when you go into the promised land, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. They were to write that on stone. Remember, you get in there, you wipe them out. Okay, so that kind of makes a little sense, but it still doesn't understand why is God so angry at Amalek? And who was Amalek? Okay, well, Amalek was the forerunner of the Amalekites. That's where we get it. But who is Amalek? Let's reverse engineer this one more step. Esau. You know, Rebecca gets pregnant, and she's pregnant with twins. And the twins are fighting each other in the womb. They're wrestling back and forth. And Esau has a title that I don't know that anybody else in the Bible has. Nobody. I mean, you may come up with a name, but I don't know. It's that God hated him. God hated Esau. Think about that. He loved Jacob whom he loved, and Esau whom he hated. I can't think of another guy in the Bible that has the title, God hated him. Judas. I don't know that it says that God hated Judas or the Pharisees and Sadducees that crucified Christ. Like, that's quite the title when it says God hated Esau. But the feeling was mutual because Esau hated God, and he hated everything that God stood for. He was a man of the world and a man of the flesh, and he hated the principles of God. And so this was this eternal struggle that's going on today. And right now we've got all the stuff going on in Europe, and the Middle East may be a little quiet for the moment. Trust me, it'll boil back over, because this battle between Jacob and Esau, Jacob meaning Israel, and Esau being all the other nations that come from that, they're still going at it. And it will continue to go and continue to get worse. So this is where the Amalekites come from. So just kind of get this concept from Esau to Amalek to the Amalekites. Haman is in this line. He's one of these. And God says there in Deuteronomy that Yohevah, however you want to pronounce God's name, will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, but he will promise to blot out his name. And not to be a spoiler to this great movie that we're watching, Haman's going to die. His 10 sons are going to die. And that's going to blot out the name of Amalek. Everything that God promised is going to happen thanks to Esther. So there.
Where was Amalek? Is he Esau's son?
Grandson. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Should have mentioned that there. By the way, this guy Shimei pops up right after, with King David. So there's King Saul, King David. And we talked about last week how David spared Shimei's life. He spared Shimei's life, so there's a Mordecai. Saul spared King Agag's life, so there is a Haman. And the two antagonists and protagonists were there, both were spared. By the way, I said that he spared King Agag's life. Why would people call me during Bible boot camp? Like, they can call me any other time of the week, right? They can't come. Come on, guys. Come on, Dad. He knows. Like, he knows. I don't know why he's come. Okay. Where was it? The Shimei thing. But Agag, he was spared. So was his wife. And apparently his wife was pregnant at the time, and she got away and had children. And there we go. So now there's a Haman. Okay, so here we go. That sets us up for this, the introduction of the villain here. So this is verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agate, elevating him, giving him a seat of higher honor than that of the other nobles. So a couple of things here. He's an Agate. What is that? The Amalekites were this race, this nation, but the Agag, there was a royal line. He was a royal Amalekite. He was Amalekite. He was in the royal line. So he was a direct descendant of King Agag. That's what that meant right there. I should probably also tell you this right here, that the whole events, the Jews celebrate this story of Esther. It's all going to be a happy ending, by the way, okay? And they celebrate this thing called the Festival of Purim every year. And what they do is they read the Book of Esther. And when they get together, you can watch this on YouTube. It's pretty interesting. Every time that the name Haman pops up, they boo. And then every time Mordecai's name pops up, yay. It's like they boo and hiss on me. So anyway, so not that you guys have to do that tonight, but okay. So by the way, after these events, there's about 4 years has passed from chapter 2 to chapter 3. So Esther has been queen for 4 years. Keep that in mind. And basically this, Haman is now what would be basically the chief of staff to Xerxes right there. So, oh, by the way, also keep this in mind. One other thing, the cliffhanger last week, we left off, Mordecai foiled a plot, an assassination attempt to King Xerxes. Everything we read right now happens because Mordecai stopped the assassination plot. If that didn't happen, there is no Haman being elevated or King Xerxes, right? So all these things happen after he stops that assassination attempt. But the other thing is that it got documented but forgotten. So for 4 years, it's been sitting there. And there's going to come a time, it just so happens that at a certain night, the king, Xerxes, is not going to be able to sleep. And it just so happens he will get up, and just so happens he will look for a book to read. And it just so happens he comes across these records, and it just so happens has to be the exact record of Mordecai 4 years earlier, right? So what a coincidence. Wow. It's amazing. God's timing is pretty incredible. So Haman, promoted to VP or whatever you want to look at it, he fills in the role of everybody that hates the Jews. Pharaoh, Hitler, Arafat, you get out the guy from the Palestinian leader right now. Fill in the gap. There's all these people that have been anti-Semitic. He's in that role. Verse 2, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. See, once you reached a certain position, you had to kneel before that leader. That's the law. So we can't really understand that, but it may be something similar. It's a bad analogy. When a judge walks in, everybody stands for the judge, right? Kind of something like that, but you're supposed to kneel, and not going to work out for him. For the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. What's that sound like? Kneel before this? Exactly. Daniel chapter 3, right? They were supposed to kneel before the statue, and they took a stand. And to bring this back around to 2020 and beyond, think in the past couple of years, when people did kneel during the national anthem, there were those that stood up and refused to kneel, right? A few of them, not a whole lot of them. There's 1 or 2 guys in the NBA, and they took some major heat. A couple guys in the NFL, they took some major heat because they refused to kneel. And the mob came after him, and I think that's what's going to happen to Mordecai here. Mordecai would not kneel down. He is basically not complying to the government standards. What happens when you don't comply with the government? Bad things happen. Well, let's hope not. All but one elderly man was the one that didn't bow down. And it says, verse 3, then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command? Why are you not kneeling? And I don't know what his response was. I would love to know what he said there. But it says, day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. He's being politically incorrect. Therefore, they told Haman about it and to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he told them he was a Jew. So, by the way, back here, apparently, remember, he told Esther, don't tell them you're a Jew. Jews are sub-level citizens because we conquered the country and they were the slaves. So they're like the captives. So they don't have positions. But by the way, Haman now has been elevated in position. He's going to be, he works at the city gate. The city gate is like City Hall. And he has basically like a judge or something like that. He's some type of position there. And they didn't know he's a Jew, but now he apparently has told them he's a Jew. Yeah, politically incorrect. By the way, if you ever wonder what I'm doing looking down here, I am building my own commentary. Like I write it down and I hear something from somebody, or maybe I hear a sermon, I just add it to it. So sometimes I go through here and I can fly through this and I go back, I'm like, I should have mentioned that. Sometimes I just like to, and here's something I wrote down. Mordecai had revealed to them that he's a Jew. He had become a judge at the gate, but now was one of the despised captives. They realized, hey, you're not supposed to be that high level position. And where he kind of controlled things in chapter 2 that got Esther to become the queen, right? He positioned all that. Now he's risking everything. And but he cannot bow down to Haman. Why? This is the enemy of God. What is Haman? He's an Amalekite. This is the wrath of the Amalekites, the sworn enemy of God. He's not going to bow down to just anybody, but especially an enemy of God. So verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people. Why take out Mordecai? He's a Jew. Let's eradicate them from society. The Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, the whole kingdom, how big was the kingdom? India to Egypt. It's a big area. That's the Middle East and Asia, all the way to Africa, right? So big area, and he's going to eradicate all of them. And he's now got the, so what you're seeing is Satan's game plan here. Remember the puppet master. Haman's just a puppet. He's not pulling the strings. Why would this guy have so much hatred for people that he doesn't even know? And he wants to destroy all the Gabe's people. So this is Satan's strategy. This goes back to Genesis 3:15. This would include all the Jews who went back to Israel also. Remember at this time, if you read the book of Ezra, Ezra took some of the Jews after Babylon fell, and they go back to Jerusalem. They're trying to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city. This is going on. They're fixing to be taken out. If there's no temple and there's no Jew, there's no Messiah. Everything, Israel is wiped out, right? And that would go against God's plan. So we'll get into that. All racism is bad, but anti-Semitism is satanic because it sets out to stop the plan of God. Keep that in mind. And I just had this conversation with this non-believer today. Interesting. I'll share this with you. He saw the little poster of Esther that I've got up in the gym, right? He goes, what's this all about? And I said, well, it's, we do Bible boot camp. We're doing a study on this Esther. Well, why? And he stops in this even before I can kind of answer his question. He says, let me ask you a question. Great. Can't wait to hear this. Now, this guy, I wouldn't say he's an atheist, but he acknowledges that there's something else up there, but that's as far as he goes. Doesn't believe the Bible, doesn't believe in his point, what he calls JC. You and your JC, that's how he refers to him as. So that's where he's coming from. And he says, let me ask you a question. Go ahead. Why do people hate the Jews? And I thought about how to respond to this guy. And I went through all of it. And I probably hesitated for like a full second, but it seemed like 30 minutes because in my mind, this has been going on for 5,000 years. This is not like a new thing. Pharaoh in Egypt tried to wipe out the Jews. The Babylonian tried to wipe out the Jews. The Persians tried to wipe out the Jews. The Roman Empire tried to wipe out the Jews. Nazi Germany, Spanish Inquisition. They've been trying to wipe out the Jews for 5,000 years. Why one little segment of the population do people have so much hatred over? Right? Like there's a lot of other groups. We got people in our country that are angry that they were slaves for a couple hundred years. They've been slaves for thousands of years. So why? And so I'm going through this playing about how to explain to him. And it seemed like 10 minutes later I answered, but it's probably only about a second. And I said, it is a spiritual battle between that. Oh, come on. No, I want to really know why people hate the Jews, because to acknowledge there's a spiritual battle, you'd have to believe that there's a spirit world, right? So he can't accept that. So then I take the historical route. I said, well, let me ask you this. When did all this start? He thought history started with the Jews anyway, with Germany and the Holocaust. And I said, look, and so I took him back to what I just explained, Pharaoh and everything. I mean, they've been trying to wipe out the Jews since the dawn of time because they're God's people, right? And he said, you know what? I've never thought about that, but they really have. His answer was, the Jews are, in his mind, they're money people. They own half of Hollywood. It's because they're always there. People hate them. And I was like, they kind of have been slaves for a couple thousand years. I don't think it's because they, were in that position. But it's very interesting to hear him say that, and he could not accept the fact. But this is what we're talking about. I want to get through this, Satan's game plan. some of you heard me talk about this before. This is Ephesians 6:12. This is the battle. We wrestle not against people or other humans, but against the rulers and authorities and principalities in the unseen world, the cosmic forces in this present darkness. It's the puppets and the puppeteers, right? This is Satan's game plan. If you think about as God's plan unfolds and as his focus narrows, Satan's focus narrows. So, for example, God's plan started with the world. He created humans, right? But then he narrows that focus from not just the whole world, but for one nation, and that was Israel. But not just the whole nation of Israel, but one of the 12 tribes, the tribe of Judah. But not just the one tribe of Judah, one family in that tribe, the line of David. But not just that, but then it gets down to one person, Jesus. And as his focus narrows, Satan's able to attack that. Now, if that doesn't make sense, here's another way of looking at it. It all goes back to Genesis 3:15. This is God speaking to Satan. I will cause hostility between you, Satan, and the woman, being Eve, and between your offspring and her offspring. Your translation may say your seed and her seed. There's two seeds. There's the seed of the woman or the offspring of the woman, and the seed of Satan or the offspring of Satan, which brings up a whole other question, right? Who's the offspring of Satan? But God declares war upon Satan right there. And he's got a death sentence. He's marked for death, whoever this woman, her child is, right? So what are you going to do? Well, if you're going to do self-preservation, you better take out the woman's child. So this is where we get into it. Attack of the seed of the woman. Here's a quick little strategy of Satan. He gets kicked off the Mount of God in Ezekiel 28. We just talked about this declaration of war on him in Genesis 3. So he's got to take out the seed of the woman. In Genesis 4, Cain tries to kill Abel, right? This attack on him. Well, but then she has other children and more children, and they grow. So Satan's got to take them all out. So we get to Genesis 6. He tries to corrupt the entire bloodline of man and the whole fallen angel, human women kind of shenanigans, whatever those things are. But someone escapes, right? One man and his family escape, which is going to be a trend. But then there's the call of Abraham, and he calls this nation. So Satan's attack goes from the whole world down to just this one nation of Israel. But then you have the famine. A lot of Jews got wiped out in the famine, but one family escapes the famine. Jacob's family, 70 of them go down into Egypt, where God had already sent one of the 12 sons ahead of time and positioned them and elevated him to become prime minister. So he's there to save the line. But then even in Egypt, they try to destroy the whole, every Jewish boy. They're going to wipe them out. But one little baby escapes in a basket and gets saved, right? And then you have Pharaoh's spirit. Even as they escape out of Egypt, Pharaoh comes after them and pins them against the sea where they got no chance, but then they escape through the Red Sea, right? And then once they get into the promised land, Satan had 400 years there while they were in Egypt to set up these Nephilim and the giants and all that stuff for when they were there to come. It's interesting that the Nephilim and the giants weren't other places. They were just right there waiting for them to come, right? But then you get the line of David, right? Once God says the line's going to come through David, he's my chosen one, the Messiah is going to come through David, Satan gets to attack that one person. Saul. You ever wonder why multiple times Saul had a tormenting spirit come up on him that I just want to kill David? Why do you want to kill the 17-year-old kid? Why? This tormenting spirit came at him to kill David multiple times. Saul didn't even understand why he wanted to do it. Jehoram, the line of David right here is his grandkids. Jehoram kills all his brothers, but one little boy escapes. The Arabs kill the whole royal family of Ahaziah, except Ahaziah escapes. Athaliah kills the whole royal family, except Joash escapes. In every case, they try to wipe out the royal family, the messianic line, but there's always some unnamed servant that lets one little baby boy escape, that preserves the line. It's interesting how it happens. And we're going to see right here, Haman's going to try to exterminate the Jews. That's the whole story here. Even in the New Testament, think about this. Herod has the massacre of the innocents and tries to wipe out all Jewish baby boys under the age of 2. One little baby boy escapes to Egypt. That becomes Jesus. And once Jesus declares his ministry, Satan attacks him personally, right? Tries to get him to fall. And he torments him all the way to the cross through Judas and everything else. So this is ongoing right now. Right now, there's anti-Semitism growing, and it's a satanic battle. It's not against flesh and blood. It's against the spirit world right here. So keep that in mind as we talk about our little villain Haman here. All right, let's move on. Verse 7. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, and I want to keep this little month in mind here of when this happens, they cast the pur. That is basically another word, they cast the lots. Think about casting dice. They were very much into superstition. So they're going to determine, hey, what day you want to kill all the Jews? We're going to line them up. We're going to slaughter them. Pick out a day. They cast the lots, and in the presence of Haman, select a day and month, and a lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar, which means they basically had a full year. There's 1 year from there, just about. I always think about Proverbs 16:33. We may throw the dice or we may cast the lots, but the Lord determines how they fall. If you go home tonight and you throw dice, the Lord controls how they fall. Think about that. I mean, like, no way. There's more important things to worry about than the dice. All things. No, wait, but what's it say in Romans? For some things work together for your good. No. A few things work together for your good. No, all things. That means everything. If I pound this, all things work together for my good if I love the Lord, which I do. Okay, so we got verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in the provinces of your kingdom. What do you notice about that statement? There is who? There are Jews here? Never tells them who it is. There's just certain people in all the provinces of your kingdom whose customs are different from those of all of the people and who do not obey the king's laws. These guys are breaking your law. There are certain people out there breaking your law. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. We need to do something about it, right? If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. Let's punish these guys. And I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So here's an opportunity to make some money. Do you remember what King Xerxes did between chapters 1 and 2? There's about a 4-year gap there too. Do you remember what he did during that time? He kicked Queen Vashti out, and he was bringing in all these VIPs from around the kingdom, and he was setting them up for something. He was getting war, right? So he goes off and he's trying to take over Europe and take over Athens and Sparta, and it didn't work out very well for him. He goes out over there with 2.6 million men, comes back with 5,000. That's a beatdown, right? Do you think that cost him some money? I think he came back. So he's probably looking for a way to replenish the funds. And Haman just says, hey, listen, we can kill these people, take all their land, take all their money, and I'll give you some 10,000 talents of silver. It's interesting here that he says 10,000 talents of silver. By the way, this would be something about what we can tell about the equivalent of $3 billion. A talent was a full year's wage, a salary, okay? So 10,000 talents of silver was something around the $3 billion if you look at today. But I want to take you back to something. Do you believe that every day, if you heard me at any point in time, you heard me talk about every dot and every comma and every name and every person that's mentioned in Scripture, they're there for a reason. If it made the cut, the Holy Spirit wants you to know. 10,000 talents of silver. Now, we don't necessarily have to know that, but it tells us that, right? Do you remember back Daniel chapter 2, the whole statue we went through there? And you remember he gets this vision of these future empires. Now, he's living in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold, the most powerful of all the emperors. But there's going to be one coming, Daniel, and it's the chest and arms of silver. And I've always realized that, it's the Medo-Persia Empire. It's Media and Persia. Think Iran and Afghanistan. It's that area. And so it was the chest and arms of silver, 2 of them that makes up this Persian Empire. Okay. But it's of silver. Come to find out, and I just learned this the past week, that the currency of Babylon was gold. They built their empire. They funded it upon King Solomon's mines. King Solomon sent out and got gold from all over the planet. It is legendary how much gold Solomon had. It's promised that he's the wealthiest man that ever lived. I mean, there's some pretty wealthy guys today. And if he's the wealthiest, he had the majority of gold on the planet. And Babylon, when they raided it, they took a lot of that gold. So they built their empire on gold. But the Persians didn't. Their currency, I'll give you one guess what it was. Silver. Silver at their time, only during Persia, was more expensive than gold. They use it as currency and payment. And I find it interesting that they were the chests of arms and silver. I think there's more to this statue that we're still learning as we go throughout the day. So I just want to bring that to your attention. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So the way this worked is they would take the ring, it would have the signature of the king on it, and they'd press it into clay. And that was like the, it's like a notary public that has to seal a document. That's what this was. But he just gives it to him. He doesn't ask who the people are. Doesn't even ask, like, okay, well, take care of it. I think you remember Xerxes was kind of convinced to get rid of Vashti, hold this beauty contest. He seems easily influenced by others, right? And here it's like, hey, give me your seal. Let me sign this. Keep the money, the king said, and do with the people as you please. So what you got here is this confiscation of assets. This act would be repeated throughout history. They would take the Jews, take their land, take their money, and take it. It was confiscation. And I'm sure that this will never happen in the United States of America, but, prepare yourself. We should. Verse 12. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman, should be Haman's orders to the, thank you, autocorrect, orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. And he didn't even read it. He just gave him the seal and said, I trust you, and go do it. I want you to take note of this. Remember, every detail is there for a reason. Why does the Holy Spirit want you to know this 13th day of the month? You don't need to know that, or maybe you do. Do you remember what the name of the month is? Nisan, is what they said. Is there anything else that happened on the 13th day of the month of Nisan? Like if you go throughout the Bible, let me answer the question. Yes, there is. This is the day before the 14th day, right? Okay. 14th day of Nisan. If you go throughout the Bible, there's all these events. Let me just tell you this. Noah's flood ended on the 17th day of Nisan, 17th day of the month. If you go through all throughout Scripture, that was the new beginning for humans. The 17th day of the month typically seems to be like a new beginning for people. Give an example. You got Noah escapes the flood on the 17th day of Nisan. It just so happens that when the Jews got through, God opened up the sea and they went through the Red Sea. Oh, that was the 17th day of Nisan. And then when they were going into the promised land, God held them back until the right day, and then they would enter the promised land. Oh, that was the 17th day of Nisan. And all this will take place with Esther on the 17th day of Nisan. And oh, by the way, it sets us up for the big one because Jesus was resurrected on, I'll give you a guess, 17th day of Nisan. Okay, there seems to be a pattern here. Now, if you backtrack that, this is day 13. The 14th day of Nisan was the day he was crucified, right? And you track the 14th day of this month all throughout Scripture, it was all the judgmental things that happened. For example, you backtrack, the 14th day was when you had the angel of death that came over and had the Passover and slaughtered everyone. That's on the 14th. And you could go, won't bore you with it. You can track this all throughout Scripture. But going back to the crucifixion, the day that they were planning and prepping and Judas was, all that stuff was on the 13th day of Nisan. And the next day he'd be crucified. They are preparing all these edicts and it will take place the next day. So I just find that interesting. And there's some more similarities. You're going to notice that there's a lot of connections to Christ in this. Okay, so sealed with the ring, 13th day of Nisan, the day before the crucifixion was that day. So that's a lot of what we read about in the Gospels. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews. You round them up, you make a list, and you kill them. And right now in cities across America, there are Islamic groups with lists. They have them. They have them in Little Rock. They have them in Dallas. They have them in St. Louis. They are making lists. Why? Because of the sworn enemy of the Jews. Young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, almost a year later, and to plunder their goods. So they're going to kill them and take all their money. Wow, what a law. And this is put into federal law there on a single day. And King Xerxes would get over $3 billion in silver to replenish his treasury, and Haman could keep whatever he could confiscate from the people. What a deal. Politicians. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province from India to Kush and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. So a year from now, guys, we're going to line them up in every man, woman, and child. A copy of the text of the edict. So the copy was sent out to everyone. So they all had copies of it, so they knew what was going on. And the decree was sent out in March 474 BC. Basically have a year to prepare for this death sentence. Interesting. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out. And by the way, we talked about this last week. They had a Pony Express system. Ride a day, rest a day, nonstop. So while one's riding, the other one's resting. And it was a very sophisticated, kind of like what we did with the Pony Express. And so they could get the word out to all this vast empire pretty quick. And the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink. Guys, we just signed their death sentence. Let's have a drink. Let's enjoy it. Right? See what kind of people do about it. But the city of Susa was bewildered. They couldn't understand what was going on. Right? I mean, can you imagine if the federal government says, listen, all white people in Little Rock, we're going to kill you. And there's the law. We just wrote it in law. You'd be like, wait a minute. I'm married to one. Okay. So they're confused. They don't know what's going on. And that's what's happened. Okay. So chapter 4, we jump into this. I call it For Such a Time as This. You're going to see the two greatest lines, the two greatest statements in the entire book are going to happen in this chapter right here. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. He couldn't do this in the city hall, so he had to do this outside the city. Mordecai, he's got to realize right now that him being a rebel, not bowing the knee one time, is about to cost him and all the Jews his life. And you got to wonder, did he question that? God, I stood up for you, right? I didn't bow down, but now we're all getting destroyed because of me. If I just did that one time, if I take a knee one day, they're not going to die. He had to have some serious doubts. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he didn't. He's much a man of faith. He also knows the amount of money Haman spent because he had a copy of the edict. So he knows what they were sold for, 10,000 pounds of silver, which is about $3 billion. Question, how much money was Jesus sold for? 30 pieces of silver, right? Interesting. But he went only as far as the king's gate because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. So this is basically their town square. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. Now, she's in the harem, and she hasn't been into the main part of the king. She hasn't seen the king for a while, we'll realize. So she's not in the know, right? They don't have the internet. They're not on social media. Only word of mouth, right? And she hasn't been told about this. And he told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with them for her people. Because little does King Xerxes know, he signed this deal. His wife's a Jew. Now, he didn't know it, but he didn't even know the Jews were the one marked for death. Her people. Now, it's interesting. He's not, Mordecai can't speak to her because she's in the harem. But he's going through this messenger. And he tells this messenger, it's her people. Remember, this guy now knows that she's a Jew. Mordecai is now known to be a Jew, and now she's a Jew. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So this is a weird law, but we can't understand this part of it. You're not just going to walk up into the White House and go to the Oval Office, right? There's security detail. And Xerxes has security detail. You don't walk right into the king's throne room, right? You got to get through people. And their law was anybody that comes unannounced, you kill them. You just take their head off. So you don't just walk in there unless you're being summoned. So she is not just risking her life before Xerxes, but for the security detail. So you don't just bust off in there. There you go. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. You're a Jew, honey, and we're all going to get killed. They're going to know you're a Jew. You think you're going to survive this? No, you're going to be in this also. But here's the verse this is the verse of the whole chapter and maybe the whole book. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. It's going to happen with you or without you. But you and your father's family will perish. And who, but for that, you have the royal position for such a time as this. Deliverance is going to come. Now, without saying faith, it screams faith. Mordecai knew that they were God's chosen people. God has a plan for Israel. He had a plan then. He has a plan in the future. It's going to happen. They can write up this edict. They can say they're going to kill us, but they're not going to stop God's plan. And cousin, you either help us or someone else will. He's showing a faith in God without mentioning God or without mentioning faith. It's also interesting. Apparently, it says your father's house, which implies that she wasn't her only child. She had some type of family there. And here is the line, like, you got to this position, y'all manipulated, but maybe you were put in this position just like Joseph was sent down to Egypt, and he went through a series of misunfortunate events, thrown into slavery, all the other stuff that happened to him, into jail, into prison, to become prime minister of Egypt for the right time. Maybe she's there for that. That's basically what it's saying, for such a time as this. Really incredible thing there. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Now, it doesn't say prayer. It doesn't say go pray, but go fast. It's almost like faith and prayer are purposely taken out of here on purpose, but it's there, right? These are Jews. We know who the Jews worship. We know they pray and fast. And yet it specifically doesn't say the word pray, or doesn't mention God, and doesn't mention faith. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And that's the great line right there. She wasn't going to do it. And his words had an impact on her. So if I perish, I perish. That's a great line. But here's a question. How long are they going to fast for? Days and night, right? Interesting. Why 3 days? That's interesting. That you remember the day before was when the edict came out on the 13th. This is the 14th day in the sign. Interesting. They're marked for death. And for 3 days, they're going to pray, although they don't say pray, but they're going to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Interesting. And on the 17th day of the month, she's going to go into the king. Interesting. See any kind of connection there? Is there details in scripture that connects everything? One thing you'll discover is the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation is a tapestry that all links from one book and one chapter and one verse. It's all one book. If you want to take out one page of the Bible, you take out the page between the Old and New Testament, because it's all one book. It flows together seamlessly. How long was Jonah in the belly of the whale? 3 days and 3 nights. Interesting. Jesus says not just 3 days, he says 3 days and 3 nights. So the Son of Man will have to be 3 days, 3 nights. And if you study Jonah, what you'll discover is Jonah apparently actually died in the whale. He wasn't hanging out in the belly whale. He died for 3 days and 3 nights and was brought back, if you read that right. It's a fascinating thing there. So she's going to, I was going to say pray and fast, but it's not exactly the case here. But they're going to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the 17th day, she's going to go in there. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Mordecai would have had the influence to have the people in the local area all commit to this. So for the next 3 days, these people are going to fast. And I'm sure they're going to pray. And they're going to pray to God, although it doesn't mention his name. But it's there, right? Okay, next week, here we go. We're going to see the most suspense-filled scenes in all literature. I don't have a literature background, and people that are literary experts would probably disagree, but I don't care if it's Shakespeare or anything. You're going to see the most ironic twists of fate in any book, not just the Bible. And Esther is the suspense novel of the Bible. I can't think of another book that you could just sit down and read, whether you're a believer or not. And you're going to see the most incredible scenes. I want you to read chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now, we're just going to cover chapters 5 and 6. But when you get to chapter 6, you're not going to be able to stop. you're not going to want to stop right there. And if you can, great. But I think you're going to want to read chapter 7. And for those of you that do this chapter a day deal, you're going to bust that because you're going to do 3 in a row. And you may want to finish the book. We're going to see the banquet of banquets. There is 2 banquets that's going to be held. This formal party, there's 2 of them. But you're going to see the banquet of all banquets, and you won't be able to put the book